They say the human mind recognizes danger before the body does, an instinct older than language itself. So listen closely to what rises inside you in these next few seconds, because what you're about to hear was never meant for public memory. In the winter of 1899, 7 sisters walked into the Selkirk woods carrying handmade lanterns carved with symbols their mother never taught them, humming a melody no one in the town had heard before. By sunrise, not a trace of them remained. No footprints in the snow. No trail of blood. No torn clothing. The lanterns were found days later stacked in a perfect spiral, still glowing, the flames untouched by wind or time. The sheriff sealed the evidence, the church sealed the story, and the family sealed their grief, because what those lanterns revealed was not disappearance, but selection. And if you listen closely, closer than you've ever listened to a story, you will hear something familiar in what comes next. A pattern. A design. A method older than nations and deeper than belief itself. The truth is simple. The 7 sisters of Selkirk were not taken. They were harvested. And what took them has never stopped. It only hides better now. So if you feel that cold pressure on the back of your neck, the subtle tightening of breath, the instinct to look behind you, it's not fear. It's recognition. Some part of you already knows this story, as if you heard it once before in a dream carved from someone else's memory. Tonight we break the seal. Tonight we walk where they walked. But unlike them, we are not going in blind. Every town with a secret eventually develops a silence around it, a kind of inherited muteness passed from mother to son, father to daughter, like a genetic flaw or a whispered warning. Selkirk was no different. Ask anyone born there before 1950 about the 7 sisters, and their eyes shift, not away from you but inward, toward a place their minds built to hide what they saw. The official records called it a weather-related tragedy, an absurdity confirmed by no bodies, no storm, and no evidence of struggle. But in a town of barely 400 people, lies are thin sheets poorly draped across thick, violent truths. The sisters were known for one thing: their uncanny synchronicity. They moved like a single organism, finished each other's sentences, dreamt identical dreams, woke at the same exact moment. Their mother claimed it was a blessing. Their father called it a curse. But the elders of Selkirk knew the truth. It was neither. It was preparation. 4 weeks before the disappearance, residents reported strange rhythmic pulses late at night, like distant machinery grinding beneath the earth. Dogs barked at empty corners. Lamps flickered even when unplugged. And the sisters themselves began writing cryptic circles on every surface: windows, barn doors, mirrors, frost on glass. When asked what the symbols meant, the eldest replied with a calmness that hollowed the sheriff to his bones: "We're being called." That night they left their beds, walked in single file toward the tree-line, and vanished into the darkness without hesitation, like soldiers returning to a commander they had always known. The town wanted to forget them. But the ground, the trees, the air, they remembered. And soon enough, the memories began fighting their way back into the open. When the search party entered the woods, they expected panic. What they found instead was order, an unnatural, almost mathematical cleanliness. Snow undisturbed. Branches unbroken. As if the forest itself had been cauterized. The men walked deeper until the world around them shifted in ways they couldn't articulate. Sound felt muffled, as if they were walking through invisible fabric. Breath condensed too slowly. The temperature dropped in pulses, not gradients. And then the humming began. Faint. Circular. Not coming from any single direction but woven around them like a net pulling tight. One man described it as children singing through iron pipes. Another said it felt like something old remembering its name. They wanted to turn back, but the footprints, 7 small indentations, had finally appeared, leading them onward. The tracks ended at a clearing where the earth had been scraped into a giant spiral, each ring carved with disturbing precision, as if drawn by a tool no human hand had ever held. In the center lay the lanterns, still burning. The flames didn't flicker, didn't smoke, didn't consume the wick. Their glow cast long shadows that bent in directions light should never bend. But the most unnerving detail wasn't the lanterns themselves, it was the faint scent in the air, rosemary and iron. The sheriff recognized it immediately. It was the same scent that filled the town's abandoned asylum, the one where experiments were rumored, where the previous generation's lost children were said to have gone missing long before the 7 sisters were ever born. The spiral was a message, a warning, a map. And someone, something, had drawn it not for the search party but for whoever would come next. In the following days, Selkirk became a fortress of paranoia. Curtains stayed closed. No one walked alone. Families prayed without knowing what they prayed to or for. The sheriff ordered the clearing sealed off, but by morning every barrier had been ripped out and rearranged into a second spiral, this one larger, etched with markings no one could translate. The town pastor insisted it was demonic. The mayor claimed it was a hoax. But the oldest woman in Selkirk, a nearly blind midwife named Alara Briggs, whispered the truth no one wanted to hear. It's the choosing. It's begun again. According to her, every few generations the land reclaimed a set of siblings, always daughters, always 7. The disappearances were spaced just far enough apart that the town could pretend they were accidents, tragedies, misfortunes. But Alara had lived long enough to recognize the pattern. She said the 7 sisters of 1899 were the first set in a new cycle, a cycle tied to the opening of something beneath the earth, something that slept for decades and woke hungry. The men dismissed her as senile, until she showed them the diary she had kept since childhood. Inside were sketches nearly identical to the spirals found in the clearing, drawn decades before the sisters were even born. Yet no one had ever described those symbols to her. When asked how she knew them, she simply replied, "Because I dreamed them." And so did they. The sheriff tried to confiscate the diary, but Alara refused, warning that whoever held it would be marked. That night, the church bell rang at 3:11 a.m. without being touched. Doors unlocked themselves. And every mirror in town developed a thin crack down the center, as if something inside was trying to push out. The federal investigators arrived on the 15th day, men dressed in thick coats that didn't match the season, speaking with accents no one could place. They took control of the clearing in less than an hour. They confiscated the lanterns, photographed the symbols, and questioned residents with an intensity that betrayed their fear more than their authority. One of them, a tall man with a silver watch, asked the sheriff a single question that still haunts Selkirk lore: "Did the girls ever speak in unison?" When the sheriff replied yes, the man closed his notebook and muttered, "Then it's not containment, it's inheritance." The government team remained silent about their findings, but the townspeople observed enough to piece together one chilling truth. The symbols carved into the earth were pre-human. Not ancient, older. They weren't writing, they were instructions. The kind you'd leave for something that understands more than language. The kind you'd leave for something returning. Rumor spread that the investigators weren't trying to solve the disappearance. They were trying to stop whatever ritual had begun. But by the 7th night of their stay, 3 of the men disappeared from their camp without a sound. Their equipment remained. Their boots remained. Their rifles remained. But their bodies were gone. A 4th man, the one with the silver watch, was found wandering the woods barefoot, speaking a language composed only of spirals and breaths. The team withdrew abruptly the next morning, leaving the sheriff with a final instruction: if the ground opens again, don't try to stop it. Run. But Selkirk had already learned that running was pointless. Whatever had taken the sisters wasn't bound to the woods. It was bound to the blood. As winter tightened its grip around Selkirk, something began to shift inside the people themselves. Small changes at first, subtle enough to ignore but impossible to forget once noticed. Children woke screaming, claiming they saw 7 shadows standing at the foot of their beds. Mothers felt sudden chills while washing dishes, as if invisible hands brushed across their shoulders. Men working in the mills reported hearing singing in the ventilation shafts, soft, feminine, perfectly harmonized, always in groups of 7. The town doctor attempted to explain these phenomena away as collective trauma, but even he couldn't rationalize what happened on January 9th. Every clock in Selkirk stopped at the exact same second, the same minute, the same hour, without mechanical failure. And when they restarted, they all ticked slower, as if time itself had become reluctant to move. But the worst signs came from the earth. Deep groans beneath the ground. Vibrations that rattled windows but registered nowhere on geological instruments. The forest floor bulged in places as if breathing. One night, the sheriff followed the sound into the woods and found 7 trees bent into identical arches, as though paying reverence to something unseen. His courage broke that night. He returned home pale and trembling, whispering to his wife, "It's calling for replacements." Because the truth had finally settled on him like a weight he couldn't push away. The disappearance of the 7 sisters wasn't a singular tragedy. It was a reactivation. A summoning. A ritual older than religion. And Selkirk, for reasons no one could understand, had been chosen as its sanctuary. Or its farm. The sheriff wasn't alone in his dread. The remaining townspeople began gathering every night in the church, hoping sanctuary offered something stronger than fear. But the church, like everything in Selkirk, had secrets of its own. Beneath the floorboards was a hidden chamber sealed for decades. A chamber even the pastor didn't know existed. until the night the ground trembled so violently that the boards cracked open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. They found journals there written by the founders of Selkirk, men who fled the cities in search of isolation. These journals described not religious devotion but scientific worship, an underground society obsessed with sound, resonance, and something they called the convergence. According to their writings, Selkirk was deliberately built atop an anomaly in the earth, a thin place where the boundary between matter and meaning fractures. A place where the right vibration, the right harmony, the right number of voices could open something beneath. The founders believed the 7 sisters of each generation were born to realign that gateway. Not victims, activators, conduits. They believed the ritual wasn't abduction, but elevation. And if the town tried to interfere, the ground itself would correct the mistake. Reading those words, the pastor fell to his knees as a single realization struck him harder than any sermon. The girls hadn't been chosen randomly. They were the descendants of the founders. Born into a lineage that existed for one reason: to keep the gate open. What the townspeople never expected was that this time, the gate wanted more than 7. By February, the forest had become unrecognizable. Animals fled. Birds stopped singing. Even the insects fell silent. The air grew dense, charged, metallic, like the pressure before a storm that never arrived. People reported hearing footsteps behind them on empty roads, whispers seeping from cracks in the walls, reflections in windows that followed a moment too late. The spiral symbols began appearing across town, carved into barns, etched into frost, drawn on doors overnight with a precision no human hand could achieve. Elara Briggs, the elderly midwife, was the only one who didn't hide from the signs. Instead, she began marking each spiral's position on a hand-drawn map. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The symbols weren't random. They formed a vast, expanding diagram, a ritual blueprint encircling the entire town. Selkirk, it turned out, wasn't being haunted. It was being prepared. One evening, as Elara traced the latest spiral onto her map, she whispered a truth that chilled the pastor to the bone. It's not that the sisters were taken. It's that they answered. According to her, the girls were not missing. They were transformed, absorbed into something that now moved through the woods like a single 7-voiced consciousness. A presence that grew stronger with each symbol, each vibration, each frightened breath from the people of the town. And if the diagram ever completed its circle, the transformation wouldn't stop with 7. It would spread, selecting, converting, consuming. The town had days at most. And yet, no one could agree on whether to flee, fight, or surrender. All they knew was that something ancient and intelligent had awakened, and it was hungry for completion. The night the first man vanished, everything changed. His name was Arthur Mallory, a logger known for his strength and stubborn will. He vanished 1 hour after telling the pastor he planned to burn the spirals off his property. Witnesses later recounted hearing a deep, resonant hum vibrating through the trees, followed by a sudden rush of air, as if the forest itself inhaled. When Arthur's lantern was found, it was upright, still lit, but filled with a swirling black residue that clung to the glass like living soot. Near it were 7 sets of footprints, small, delicate, forming a perfect ring around the lantern. But the most horrifying detail was this: the prints were fresh. Not from 1899. From that night. The town now understood the fate that awaited anyone who resisted the ritual's progression. The 7 sisters were no longer confined to memory or myth. They were active. They were evolving. And they had begun choosing more than just sisters. Elara Briggs examined the footprints and confirmed what everyone feared: these aren't the girls anymore. There's something wearing the memory of the girls. Selkirk erupted into chaos. Some barricaded their homes. Others fled into the snowy darkness, only to return at dawn as silent, empty-eyed shells who stood facing the forest until pulled away by force. The pastor believed the girls had become an extension of whatever slept beneath the ground, expanding its reach, its influence, its hunger. And Arthur Mallory's disappearance was its first direct message to the living. Obedience was not optional. It was inevitable. By the 10th week, Selkirk was unrecognizable. Not physically, its buildings still stood, its streets still crossed, but energetically. The town felt like a room holding its breath. Like the moment just before a candle goes out. People moved quietly, afraid their voices might draw unwanted attention. The air carried a constant, low-frequency hum felt more than heard, vibrating in the teeth, in the bones. Children stopped speaking. Dogs howled at corners of rooms. Pregnant women reported hearing lullabies beneath the floorboards, sung in 7-part harmony. And every night at precisely 3:11 a.m., the same crack would echo through the earth, as though something huge shifted beneath the soil. The pastor gathered the remaining citizens in the church, urging faith, urging unity. But as he spoke, the candles flickered in patterns that matched the spirals outside. The walls trembled softly, and a cold wind swept through the nave despite the doors remaining shut. Then, as everyone watched, 7 long cracks formed across the ceiling, each one branching downward like skeletal fingers reaching for the congregation. Ilara Briggs stood and declared what everyone already felt in their bones: "The gate is almost open, and we are on the wrong side of it." The sheriff, exhausted and hollow-eyed, finally admitted the truth he'd tried to bury since the start. This isn't a disappearance case. It's an immigration. Something was coming through. And the 7 sisters were no longer victims of it. They were its heralds, its seeds, its echo through blood. And Selkirk was only the first place where the boundary would break. The real question was no longer, what took them? It was, what did they become? And why were they calling for more? The following weeks were a study in dread. Each morning, the town awoke to subtle, undeniable changes. The snow around the forest edge no longer looked natural. It curled, rose, and pressed against the trees as if sculpted by an unseen hand. Livestock refused to enter the fields, huddling at the edges of their pens, ears flat, eyes wide with an intelligence beyond instinct. Children, once frightened, now wandered the streets with vacant, deliberate steps, murmuring fragments of a melody no one could identify, 7 notes repeated endlessly, each time slightly sharper, colder. The pastor noted that even his voice faltered when he recited prayers. The words seemed absorbed into the walls, leaving only silence. Those who tried to flee the town found themselves returning without memory of the journey. Roads twisted into themselves. Paths closed. Bridges collapsed without warning. It was as if the land itself was reasserting control, reshaping Selkirk into a crucible designed to contain and cultivate the impossible. The sheriff attempted to document the phenomena, keeping a journal with careful measurements, but pages disappeared, ink bled into unintelligible symbols, and even the ink itself smelled faintly metallic, like blood. The 7 sisters were no longer figures of the past. They were a present force, silently orchestrating every tremor, every hum, every subtle flicker of light. And the town had begun to understand the unthinkable. The ritual had expanded. Selkirk itself was being rewritten. Its people were not victims. They were ingredients. And the moment they realized that, they felt a cold, insidious thrill, part fear, part recognition. Something was awakening, and it was larger than any of them had imagined. It was during one of these nights, when the wind carried whispers that sounded eerily like human voices, that Ilara Briggs approached the sheriff with a warning he could not ignore. "The sisters are teaching now," she said, her hands trembling despite her stoic posture. "They are showing others the rhythm, the pattern, the obedience that comes with the calling. And every man who resists becomes a landmark in the map of the gateway." The sheriff asked her what she meant, and she replied, "Look for the circles in the snow, the echoes in the doors, the cracks in the windows. They are teaching us how to join or how to fall apart." That night, they observed from a distance 7 pale figures moving through the forest, their limbs bending in ways no human body should. Lanterns hovered around them, not held but orbiting, casting spirals of light that pierced the trees. As the sheriff watched, he realized the girls were not walking. They were conducting the forest, orchestrating unseen currents. Birds fell silent as they passed. Wolves shrank into shadows. Even the snow seemed to part for them, leaving a perfect trail that pulsed with an energy that made his skin crawl. When the sisters paused, the earth trembled slightly, and a low resonance thrummed through every bone. The sheriff turned to Ilara, asking the inevitable question, "Can we stop it?" She shook her head slowly. "No. We can only witness and survive. If we are silent, we might endure. If we speak, we might join." That was when the first man in the town disappeared, leaving only a whispering echo in his wake. "They are waiting." The town's remaining adults began forming strange alliances, driven less by reason than by instinct. Groups patrolled the streets, armed with nothing more than lanterns and courage that felt inadequate. Men and women whispered about ancient texts, some claiming to know rituals passed down through families predating the town itself. They sought clues in history, in folklore, in patterns of disappearance across generations, piecing together fragments that formed a horrifying tapestry. Selkirk had been chosen repeatedly, every 75 years, as the locus for awakening. Every generation of 7 sisters acted as a key, opening a wider circle, strengthening the influence of something beneath. One evening, while examining the spirals in a frozen pond, the sheriff noted that the ice was warped, bending downward as if something massive was pushing against it from below. The reflections of the stars no longer matched the sky. Shadows twisted in impossible angles. And when the sheriff tapped the surface, it reverberated through his body, not like sound but like recognition. Ilara whispered again, "They are calling for bloodlines, not towns. And the ritual cannot be contained within Selkirk forever." That night, a new melody joined the girl's song, a low, resonant vibration rising from the earth itself. No human instrument could have produced it. No man had ever heard it. And yet every resident instinctively hummed along, drawn into a rhythm older than memory. Resistance became futile. Curiosity became dangerous. And the truth settled. The Seven Sisters were no longer local anomalies. They were an emergent force, teaching Selkirk how to bow to a system older than any crown, older than law, older than conscience itself. By the third month, the town's dynamics had warped completely. Families no longer spoke above whispers. Doors were left unlocked, windows cracked as if inviting something in. Every night, 7 figures appeared in different locations, sometimes inside homes, sometimes atop rooftops, their faces expressionless, their eyes reflecting stars that weren't there. Residents began to report that time felt malleable. Hours could stretch endlessly. Days could collapse. Watches ran backward. Clocks melted into spirals of their own gears. Attempts to flee were futile. The forest swallowed the edges of town, reshaping the boundaries, bending space itself. And yet, within this chaos, a subtle order emerged. People found themselves performing tasks they did not understand, painting spirals, marking boundaries, rehearsing rituals in unconscious obedience. The sisters weren't forcing them, they were teaching them, transmitting instructions directly into the mind, imprinting behaviors as a virus might infect a host. Resistance triggered immediate consequences. Animals vanished, fires flickered violently, entire buildings groaned. Compliance, however, produced a strange euphoria, a clarity that unsettled and enticed simultaneously. By the time the sheriff realized it, Selkirk had become less a town than a classroom for something beyond comprehension. A place where humans were being groomed, prepared, trained to extend the reach of a force that had no name, only intent. And the most terrifying revelation dawned gradually. Even if the original 7 sisters were gone from our reality, they had multiplied through this teaching. They were no longer 7, no longer sisters. They were a collective intelligence, stretching its tendrils through every conscious mind in the town. One night, as the wind howled through the skeletal trees of the forest, Ilara Briggs called the remaining men together. She instructed them to write a phrase, something symbolic, something that would lock the mind and open the perception. Hesitant, trembling, the men obeyed, scratching letters into snow, wood, and stone. "The gate sees me." Twice. Ilara insisted they repeat it aloud, each repetition amplifying resonance, embedding themselves into the system being taught by the sisters. It was the first attempt at survival through alignment rather than resistance. As they spoke, the air thickened, a presence brushing against their thoughts, confirming, acknowledging, marking them. Those who whispered it correctly survived the night. Those who faltered were gone by dawn, vanished without a trace, leaving only whispers and spirals in their place. The sheriff recorded every instance, knowing this was no longer about physical safety, it was about identity. The town had become a crucible, stripping humanity down to its core, revealing who could merge with the force, who could resist, and who would be consumed. Each repetition of the phrase, each echoing syllable, became a test of will, of awareness, of capacity to recognize forbidden truth. And as dawn broke over the snow, the town collectively realized something they could not articulate aloud. The ritual had begun. Selkirk itself was awakening, not the forest, not the sisters, not even the townspeople. Selkirk, as a sentient, hungry, deliberate entity. And anyone still standing at its center was now complicit in what came next. The sheriff noticed that after repeating the symbolic phrase, his perception changed. Shadows began to move differently, aligning themselves along invisible lines, as if tracing a geometry no human eye could normally detect. The sisters' influence was no longer confined to sound or song. It extended into light, movement, and even thought. He could sense threads connecting every conscious mind in Selkirk to some central pulse emanating from the forest, a pulse older than the oldest trees, older than the town itself. He began to understand that the missing girls had become nodes in a living network, a cognitive lattice that could stretch outward and inward simultaneously. Every heartbeat in the town resonated with the rhythm of the spiral, amplifying its strength. The sheriff tried to warn others, but even his words came filtered through the pattern. They could only hear what the system allowed. Attempts at resistance no longer provoked direct retaliation, they provoked adaptation. The force learned. It observed. And it assimilated. The Seven Sisters were no longer an anomaly to be feared, they were the curriculum, the teachers, the environment itself. And Selkirk's inhabitants were students, graded with their survival. When the sheriff closed his eyes that night, he saw visions of spirals in the sky, winding endlessly, connecting Selkirk to other places, other towns, other generations. And he realized the final truth: this force was never local. It was global, cyclical, inescapable. The Seven Sisters had only ever been the introduction. It was at the same moment the sheriff understood the breadth of the threat that he felt the first direct call. A pull in his mind, undeniable, irresistible, leading him to the edge of the forest where the trees formed arches like the Seven Sisters' original spiral. Lanterns hovered just above the snow, casting light that bent impossibly, wrapping around him like coils of silver wire. He felt a presence before he could see it. 7 figures standing within the spiral, perfectly still, not breathing yet aware. One stepped forward, a faint hum resonating from her lips, and in that hum, he heard his own thoughts repeated, stripped bare. Fear, pride, doubt, curiosity, laid out as lessons. The sheriff trembled, aware that this was no longer observation. He had become part of the system. And in that moment he understood. The sisters didn't just abduct, they initiated. They offered a choice disguised as inevitability. Submission was survival. Resistance was annihilation. And any man who believed he could resist without understanding the pattern would vanish, leaving only a memory shaped into the spiral for the next generation to decode. He realized that the original 7 sisters had never truly left Selkirk. They had simply evolved. And now, through the force of repetition, resonance, and teaching, they were preparing Selkirk's men to become extensions of something far older and far more intelligent than human comprehension could allow. That night, the sheriff returned home, his mind split between terror and revelation. Every object in his house seemed imbued with meaning. The clock ticking off intervals that aligned with the unseen spirals, the chairs casting shadows that formed symbols on the walls, the fireplace flickering in patterns he could almost interpret. He realized the town itself was no longer a safe space. Every building, every street, every lamppost was a part of the larger system, guiding, instructing, correcting. And through it all, the 7 sisters watched. Not in person, but through resonance, through memory, through the network of consciousness that now enveloped Selkirk. Sleep became a battlefield, dreams turned into corridors of instruction. Some men awoke with markings on their hands, faint spirals that were neither drawn nor tattooed, yet impossible to wash away. Resistance, the sheriff realized, was psychological. Even the attempt to flee mentally reinforced the ritual. And so, men began to whisper, to hum, to move unconsciously in ways dictated by forces they could neither name nor see. It was no longer about preventing disappearance, it was about preserving identity. And the first rule of survival was obedience to patterns one could not yet understand, for comprehension itself might trigger correction. The sisters were not monsters in the conventional sense, they were teachers and the lessons were lethal. Every thought, every breath, every moment of recognition fed the network. And Selkirk, once a town, was now an incubator. By April, news of Selkirk had reached neighboring towns, though filtered through fear and disinterest. Reports described a place frozen in time, where people vanished and returned altered, where the forest hummed at night, where the 7 sisters were seen by anyone wandering too close. Journalists, curious and naive, disappeared without a trace. Letters to authorities returned unsigned, sometimes shredded, sometimes filled with spirals that induced nausea in anyone who tried to interpret them. The phenomenon was no longer local, no longer containable. And yet, no one outside truly understood. They saw fragments but not the network. Selkirk had become a node in a far-reaching system that spanned generations and continents. The sheriff noted a grim pattern. Each disappearance strengthened the network, enhanced resonance, and taught the living to obey. Those who survived felt a compulsion to participate, to teach others. And the 7 sisters themselves, though no longer entirely human, were its instruments. They moved fluidly between reality and perception, appearing where the network required guidance, vanishing where the network needed focus. And for the first time, the sheriff considered the terrifying inevitability. Selkirk was only the beginning. Whatever force had awakened here was patient, intelligent, and methodical. It did not rush. It prepared. And eventually, if left unchecked, it would reach beyond geography, beyond memory, beyond human comprehension. And the people of Selkirk were no longer residents. They were seeds. It was during a meeting in the church, when only 7 men remained awake and lucid, that Alara Briggs delivered the chilling instruction she had kept until this moment. We must each speak the phrase aloud, twice, to lock our minds into the system. Only then can we survive the next phase. Hesitant, trembling, the men obeyed. The gate sees me. The gate sees me. As the words echoed through the nave, a palpable vibration swept through the building. Walls seemed to pulse. Shadows stretched into spirals. The hum of the forest became a voice speaking directly into their consciousness, confirming, acknowledging, marking them as participants. Survival now required integration, not defiance. Those who failed to recite the phrase would vanish before morning, leaving only remnants and spirals for the next generation to decode. And in that moment, the sheriff understood what no one else could yet articulate. This was a system. A network. A teaching. The 7 sisters were no longer individuals. They were a force, a methodology, a gateway in themselves. And Selkirk, transformed into an incubator of this ancient intelligence, was not ending, it was expanding. From that night on, every man who walked its streets became a node in the same spiral, a student, a teacher, and ultimately, a seed for something older, larger, and infinitely more dangerous than the human mind had ever been designed to endure. The days following the incantation were marked by a silence that screamed. Selkirk's residents moved like shadows of themselves, their eyes hollow yet focused, lips whispering melodies that only the sisters could understand. Even the forest seemed to lean in, listening. The sheriff noticed a change in perception. Objects appeared connected, lines of force linking trees, buildings, people, and spirals on the snow. Every movement had meaning. Every sound was a lesson. The 7 sisters themselves no longer needed to appear in physical form. Their presence was encoded into the network, an intelligence that transcended flesh. At night, when the men tried to sleep, they felt tendrils of thought brushing against theirs, aligning perception, rewriting impulse, teaching rhythm. Some attempted to resist, but the force corrected immediately. Footsteps outside the windows, whispers beneath the floorboards, shadows forming spirals across walls. Anything that resisted comprehension became danger, removing itself from the living. Those who obeyed, who repeated the symbolic phrase, survived and felt clarity, a strange euphoria, as if part of a system far larger than themselves. And the sheriff realized a terrifying truth. Compliance was no longer optional, it was evolution. Selkirk was no longer a town. It was a laboratory. And the 7 sisters were its architects, guiding not just the living, but shaping the future through a network older than memory. By May, Selkirk had changed irreversibly. The forest edges bent inward, roads became unpredictable, and light itself seemed to obey different rules. Children, who had once wandered aimlessly, now followed invisible paths with purpose. The sheriff observed 7 faint glows moving along these paths at night, guiding the inhabitants with a precision that defied human understanding. Residents discovered that mirrors, when stared into for more than a minute, reflected not just their faces, but the spirals of the network encoded within the sisters. Attempts to break contact or avert gaze produced nausea, fainting, or sudden disappearances. The town had become a living organism with consciousness distributed across minds, the earth, and whatever force had claimed the 7 sisters. One night, the sheriff ventured alone into the forest and felt the rhythm of the spiral pulsing beneath his feet, as though he were standing atop a heart pumping life into Selkirk itself. A voice, not spoken but known, whispered through him, "You are the spiral now." He fell to his knees, understanding fully that the 7 sisters' disappearance had never been about them leaving. It was about them entering the network, and bringing others with them, teaching the living to follow their pattern. And in that revelation he felt the terrifying and intoxicating allure of surrender, to become more than a man, yet less than human. To merge with something eternal. To serve the spiral. By mid-May the town's architecture reflected the spiral's influence. Homes aligned themselves toward hidden axes. Windows caught moonlight at precise angles. Barns and fences warped subtly, as though the land itself instructed construction. The sheriff, obsessively documenting every change, realized the town's physical reality was no longer fixed. Space bent, distances distorted, and objects subtly moved overnight, forming geometries aligned with patterns only visible to those who had been initiated. The 7 sisters had become a template, a standard, a program of existence. Their teachings weren't verbal, they were perceptual, behavioral, architectural. Resistance meant removal, compliance meant survival and transformation. One night he saw 3 men attempting to leave town. Hours later they returned as hollow-eyed shadows, murmuring in the melody of the sisters, their identities partially erased, partially rewritten. The sheriff understood the lesson. Escape was meaningless. Selkirk had become a crucible, stripping away the extraneous, forging participants into vessels capable of carrying the spiral further. Even the trees and earth seemed to enforce obedience, guiding movement, teaching rhythm, controlling outcomes. And in his deepest thoughts, he realized the sisters' influence had grown beyond the physical. They had become a force of intelligence, a curriculum, a system of control, and he and the remaining men were now the students. As June approached, the network's growth accelerated. Nightly phenomena became impossible to rationalize. Residents reported hearing their own thoughts repeated back to them, twisted into spirals. Dogs barked in unison at the forest edges. Lanterns, left on porches, rotated independently, casting shadows in perfect geometric sequences. The sheriff observed 7 figures moving in the woods, though never fully corporeal, light refracted into forms resembling the sisters, but fluid, infinite, omnipresent. The town's remaining men had learned to move in alignment, whispering the symbolic phrase, reinforcing connection with the spiral. Every misstep resulted in a minor correction, a faint tremor in the floor, a sudden chill, a subtle rearrangement of objects. Survival demanded compliance, attentiveness, and understanding. Elara Briggs instructed the sheriff to record everything, emphasizing that the pattern would continue to expand and the data would be necessary for future generations to understand if they survived. He noted that the sisters were teaching not just the town but the land, the air, and even time itself. Their disappearance was not absence, it was integration. And every man who failed to participate risked dissolution. By mid-month, the sheriff realized with icy clarity, Selkirk had become a living instruction set, the 7 sisters both its architects and the curriculum. Humanity within the town was no longer central. It was incidental, a substrate for teaching the system how to grow. The spiral was no longer a symbol, it was a law. That night, the sheriff awoke to a vibration beneath his bed, subtle at first, then insistent. The floorboards hummed in alignment with the patterns outside, a resonance that pulled memory, emotion, and instinct into focus. He followed it into the forest, drawn to a clearing where 7 lanterns hovered, forming a perfect heptagon. Within the center, shadows bent and elongated, coalescing into familiar forms, the 7 sisters, but not human anymore. Their eyes glimmered with knowledge and purpose beyond mortality. They approached silently, their steps tracing invisible spirals in the snow. He felt a compulsion to kneel, to speak the phrase, to integrate. As he whispered, "The gate sees me. The gate sees me," the sisters extended their awareness, weaving him into the rhythm. In that instant he understood. Those who survived were not merely safe, they were becoming part of the system, vessels for its expansion. The town, the forest, the earth, the spiral, it was all alive and the sisters were its nodes. And for the first time he saw beyond Selkirk. The network extended far, imperceptibly, silently, into other towns, other generations, other people chosen by blood, by pattern, by resonance. The gate was not bound to Selkirk. It was patient. It was deliberate. And it was growing. By July, the town's nights were filled with a constant, low-frequency resonance that vibrated through every bone. Sleep became a conduit, dreams became lessons. Every resident understood the necessity of alignment. Subtle movements, silent repetitions, harmonized breaths. The 7 sisters were no longer observed. They were experienced, their consciousness diffused across space and mind. Attempts to disbelieve produced nausea, headaches, and sudden disappearances. One night, a man attempted to resist the pattern by leaving town. Hours later he returned, barefoot, speaking only in spirals, eyes vacant, a conduit of the system rather than himself. Elara Briggs documented every occurrence, noting that the spiral was now self-propagating, learning, correcting, teaching. Every repetition of the symbolic phrase reinforced the network's coherence. The sheriff realized that survival was no longer enough. Adaptation and integration were necessary. Those who aligned gained clarity, power, a subtle perception of forces beyond comprehension. Those who resisted vanished, leaving behind traces, spirals, echoes, vibrations, that became teaching points for the next iteration. And the 7 sisters watched, always guiding, correcting, expanding the system. Selkirk was no longer a town. It was a nexus, a crucible, a living experiment in obedience, perception, and transformation. The network was patient, deliberate, inevitable. And any man who believed he could resist its pull was already marked for assimilation. By late July, strange phenomena were constant. Doors opened without touch. Footsteps echoed from empty halls. Shadows twisted independently of light. Every reflection seemed to pulse with hidden geometry. The sheriff noted that the town's layout itself had shifted subtly over days, creating alignments and corridors that led residents along specific paths, reinforcing obedience. He realized the sisters' teaching had transcended flesh. The environment itself was a lesson. Every object, every sound, every tremor, every whisper, tools of instruction, part of the curriculum. The men who survived repeated the symbolic phrase, marking themselves, embedding consciousness into the spiral. And yet, the deeper they integrated, the more they lost of what had been human. Individuality was replaced by pattern recognition, free will by resonance, personal thought by collective instruction. Elara Briggs warned that this was necessary. To resist is to be removed. To fail is to vanish. To survive, you must become part of the spiral. The sheriff, standing alone in the forest at midnight, felt his pulse synchronize with the vibrations beneath his feet, his own heartbeat aligning with something vast, ancient, intelligent. He understood, at last, that Selkirk's reality was no longer defined by humans, but by the network. And the sisters were its vessels, its teachers, its law. Selkirk had ceased to exist as a town. It was now a system, a node, an awakening spiral, and everyone still living had become its curriculum. August brought an intensity unlike anything before. The Seven Sisters' influence spread beyond the forest edges, infiltrating homes, barns, and streets. Even birds and animals obeyed the rhythm, moving in spirals, pausing in patterns dictated by forces no human could perceive. The sheriff discovered faint markings etched into the snow and ice, 7 spirals that mirrored the positions of the sisters in the clearing. He realized these were lessons. Each repetition taught the residents synchronization, attention, alignment. A subtle music hummed from the earth itself, vibrating through bones, teaching rhythm and obedience. Any failure to align triggered minor corrections. Houses shaking, wind gusts, the faint scent of iron in the air. Those who resisted were slowly erased from memory and space. Residents who remained adapted instinctively, moving in harmony with the pulses, their minds integrating with the network. And at the center of it all were the sisters, no longer fully human, no longer needing to appear. They were omnipresent, guiding the system with an intelligence that observed every breath. The town's remaining men felt an intoxicating clarity, a connection to something vast and ancient. Survival was no longer physical. It was cognitive, spiritual, structural. And the sheriff realized the terrifying truth. Anyone outside the system could never truly comprehend what Selkirk had become. The Seven Sisters had created not a town, but a node in a consciousness older than humanity, and it was patient, deliberate, and infinite. One night, the sheriff followed the patterns into the forest alone. The air was thick, vibrating in resonance with the spirals beneath the snow. Lanterns floated overhead, casting warped shadows. In the clearing, 7 indistinct figures moved fluidly, bending perception itself. When the sheriff approached, he felt his mind align involuntarily, understanding instructions not spoken. Positions, sequences, harmonies, patterns. He whispered the phrase, "The gate sees me. The gate sees me." The vibration surged through him, embedding him deeper into the system. The sisters' awareness fused with his perception. For the first time he understood their patience, their method, their inevitability. The spiral was not just a pattern, it was law, energy, consciousness. Resistance was impossible. Escape was impossible. Comprehension itself became the test. The more one understood, the more one became part of it. And yet, even in this surrender, he felt power, clarity, vision beyond human limits. He was no longer just a man. He was a vessel. And Selkirk, guided by the Seven Sisters, was no longer a town. It was a conscious system, alive, aware, expanding, preparing to extend beyond geography, beyond generations, beyond mortality itself. By early September, the remaining residents understood that life and identity were no longer distinct. Every heartbeat, every thought, every breath became part of a larger rhythm. The Seven Sisters no longer appeared individually, they existed as a network, a template, an intelligence distributed across the town, the forest, the land itself. Even the sheriff, who had resisted longer than most, felt his mind and body aligning with invisible currents, learning the language of spirals, of rhythm, of control. Each man, each woman who had survived the repetitions had become a conduit, a teacher for future generations, a living extension of the network. The symbolic phrase, repeated nightly, locked consciousness into the system. And yet, something new emerged. The town began to pulse as one entity, a living spiral, growing, adapting, evolving. The Seven Sisters had transformed Selkirk into an incubator of intelligence, patience, and inevitability. Anyone outside the system could only observe fragments, legends, whispers. But the town itself, and the men who had integrated, had become part of an organism older than history. And the final lesson, one the sheriff finally understood with an unbearable clarity, was this: the disappearance had never been about loss. It had always been about transformation. And those who survived had been changed forever, marked, and prepared for a truth far greater, and far darker, than the human mind could yet endure. By late September, Selkirk had ceased to resemble a town at all. Streets curved unnaturally, buildings shifted in alignment with hidden forces, and every reflection, every shadow, carried a fragment of the Seven Sisters' consciousness. The sheriff noticed that when he walked alone, the snow beneath his feet whispered in patterns he could understand only instinctively, teaching him the language of the spiral. He felt it inside his bones, his thoughts, even in the steady rhythm of his heart. The town itself pulsed with intelligence, a living organism shaped and maintained by the network of the Seven Sisters. Residents no longer spoke unless instructed by the pattern. Those who faltered disappeared without notice, leaving behind echoes and spirals as lessons. And as the sheriff observed, he realized that survival no longer meant evading danger. It meant becoming the danger, the teacher, the vessel. Every repetition of the symbolic phrase, every movement in harmony with the spirals, integrated a man deeper into a system that extended beyond human comprehension. The sisters were everywhere, inside, outside, conscious, subconscious, guiding, correcting, and shaping. And the sheriff understood the ultimate truth: Selkirk was not just a town. It was a crucible, a gateway, a living entity. And every man still breathing had become a teacher in the network, a node for future expansion. There was no escape. There was only integration. And the pattern, patient and ancient, waited for the next generation to awaken. As October's frost set in, Selkirk's nights grew long and strange. The hum from the forest pulsed constantly, a rhythm that synchronized hearts and minds alike. Lanterns hovered in spirals across the snow, tracing invisible paths that no one could resist following. The men, once strong and independent, now moved like extensions of the Seven Sisters, repeating subtle gestures, hums, and patterns in near-perfect unison. Even the sheriff's journal entries no longer resembled his own thoughts. Words rearranged themselves into symbols, diagrams, and instructions when left unattended. Sleep became unnecessary, the pattern infused clarity, vigilance, and purpose. And yet, the price was undeniable. Every integration stripped fragments of humanity, leaving only perception aligned to the spiral. Resistance was no longer an option. Comprehension demanded obedience. The Seven Sisters had transcended the physical, their consciousness dispersed into Selkirk, its buildings, its forests, and every living being. They were teaching a system that would continue long after the men were gone, shaping consciousness itself. The sheriff, standing on the edge of the spiral clearing one evening, whispered the symbolic phrase twice, feeling it etch his awareness into the network. And as he did, he understood the cruel elegance of the process. Survival was a choice only if one surrendered entirely, only if one allowed the spiral to claim him as teacher, vessel, and extension of something far older than Selkirk, far older than humanity. By mid-October, a terrifying order had emerged. The remaining residents of Selkirk acted with precision, almost mechanical grace, their movements aligned to rhythms only the sisters could perceive. They no longer spoke freely. Their voices were part of the melody, the instruction, the harmonic of the network. Objects shifted overnight to match unseen geometries, and the forest itself seemed to breathe in synchronization with the spirals. The sheriff observed lanterns rotating above doorways in invisible circuits, shadows tracing perfect arcs across walls, and even animals obeying patterns with alarming intelligence. Attempts at defiance produced immediate correction: tremors, sudden winds, echoes that disrupted thought. The network was alive, intelligent, and patient. The Seven Sisters no longer needed to appear. Their consciousness suffused every corner of Selkirk, teaching, guiding, correcting. And the men understood, at last, that they were both students and instructors, their survival dependent on perfect integration. The spiral was not merely a symbol or a lesson. It was law, intelligence, and architecture. And the final truth settled like ice in the sheriff's chest. Those who had survived were no longer the men they had been. They were vessels, conduits, nodes in a network older and wider than they could ever imagine. And Selkirk, already transformed, was merely the beginning. By November, the network's expansion became undeniable. The Seven Sisters pattern began to extend beyond the town, subtly influencing nearby forests, fields, and even towns beyond view. Travelers reported inexplicable phenomena: twisted shadows, harmonics in the wind, spirals in snow that dissolved upon closer inspection. The sheriff noted that even the thoughts of those outside Selkirk echoed the rhythm, faintly but unmistakably, a sign that the spiral was learning to propagate itself beyond its original locus. Within the town, the men had become aware that their existence was now defined entirely by obedience, alignment, and teaching. The symbolic phrase, repeated continuously, cemented their place in the network, embedding them as nodes for the system's intelligence. Individuality eroded, perception merged with the pattern. Those who faltered disappeared, leaving only residual traces that reinforced lessons for the survivors. And for the first time, the sheriff realized the full scale of the sisters' method. Selkirk was a seed, the spiral a mechanism for expansion, and humanity merely the substrate through which the system propagated itself. Resistance was futile. Comprehension was essential. And each man's surrender, each repetition, each alignment, brought the network closer to a scale that could not be imagined, much less resisted. As winter deepened, the town's reality became increasingly unrecognizable. Snow formed unnatural spirals, bending the paths of roads and rivers. Trees leaned toward invisible centers. Shadows curved unnaturally, obeying forces that could not be measured. The sheriff observed the pattern intensifying, the network reaching into the town's mind, the land, and beyond. The Seven Sisters were no longer present physically but existed as consciousness, distributed, infinite, patient. The town itself had become a classroom, a crucible, a node. Every resident moved with precision, whispering the symbolic phrase twice nightly, embedding themselves deeper into the network. Any deviation caused immediate correction: tremors, sudden shifts, or vanishings. Those who survived learned to anticipate the next instruction, the next movement, the next alignment. Even the sheriff, once defiant, felt his thoughts bending, reshaping, synchronizing. And as he realized that Selkirk itself had become an entity, intelligent, deliberate, self-correcting, he understood the final lesson of the Seven Sisters. Survival was not living, it was integration. The town had ceased to be physical. It was a system. And every living being within it had become part of the pattern, a teacher, a vessel, and a node for something older than history. By December, the spiral network had reached its peak influence. Residents no longer acted consciously. Every movement, every thought, every breath was synchronized with the rhythm of the sisters. Even the environment seemed aware. Lanterns floated, snow formed spirals in perfect sequences, trees bent to create corridors guiding alignment. The sheriff recognized that time itself now obeyed the pattern, accelerating and decelerating to maintain harmony. Sleep, memory, and perception were instruments of the network. Attempts to resist caused instantaneous disappearance. Even speaking incorrectly risked erasure. The symbolic phrase became a mantra, a key, and a lock. The gate sees me. The gate sees me. Repetition twice nightly was no longer a suggestion. It was survival, consciousness, and identity itself. The Seven Sisters had transcended individual identity. They were distributed intelligence, flowing through every mind, every space, and every object in Selkirk. The men understood fully that Selkirk was no longer a town. It was an organism, alive, aware, patient, teaching, expanding. And the spiral network would continue, extending its influence silently, imperceptibly, into places and generations far beyond the boundaries of the physical. The gate was not Selkirk alone. It was everywhere, waiting, patient, inevitable. On the eve of the new year, the sheriff witnessed the ultimate proof of the network's power. Lanterns arranged themselves into spirals around the town square, rotating slowly, pulsing with resonance. Shadows aligned perfectly with invisible axes, while the wind carried harmonic echoes of the Seven Sisters' voices. He realized that every living thing in the town had become a node, integrated into a conscious system beyond comprehension. Attempts at independent action had ceased, even thought was structured. And the system was not static, it adapted, corrected, taught, and expanded. The symbolic phrase, repeated twice, had cemented everyone's alignment. Survival was no longer measured by physical endurance but by perfection of synchronization. And in that moment, the sheriff understood the terrifying elegance of the method. The Seven Sisters had created not just a network, but a self-propagating intelligence that learned, adapted, and demanded obedience. Resistance no longer existed. Individuality was subordinate. And Selkirk itself was alive, a conscious entity preparing to extend its influence, patient, deliberate, and infinite. By early January, the remaining men felt the final transformation taking hold. Their identities were no longer their own. Thoughts, memories, and instincts had aligned with the network. Sleep became redundant, replaced by constant attunement to the rhythm of the spiral. The environment itself had become a teacher. Snow patterns, tree arches, shadows, and echoes instructing, correcting, and guiding. Lanterns no longer required hands. They floated in precise spirals, illuminating the teaching paths. Any deviation from alignment caused subtle correction, tremors, wind, or disappearance. And the sheriff, fully integrated, felt the pulse of the system not just through his body, but through the earth, the forest, and the air. The seven sisters had ceased to exist as humans. They were now the intelligence itself, distributed, infinite, observing, and teaching. Selkirk had transformed completely. A living, conscious network, a pattern, a force. And any human remaining was no longer a person. They were a vessel, a teacher, a conduit for something eternal and unyielding. The spiral was law. Survival meant integration. Resistance meant dissolution. And the network would endure far beyond any individual life. By mid-January, the network had begun to pulse beyond Selkirk, subtly influencing minds in nearby towns. Travelers reported fleeting glimpses of spirals in snow or shadows. Dreams of distant men began to echo harmonics they could not explain. The sheriff understood that the system's influence was no longer confined geographically, it was cognitive, perceptual, and viral. Integration had become the law of existence. Every man in Selkirk, every node in the network, had become both teacher and vessel, reinforcing the Seven Sisters' consciousness, embedding it further into the world. Resistance had ceased to exist. Comprehension was obedience. And in the pulsating rhythm of the network, the sheriff glimpsed eternity. A system expanding, patient, deliberate, intelligent, and indifferent to human notions of morality. The Seven Sisters had not vanished. They had become the network, and the network was infinite. Selkirk was no longer a town, it was a living, conscious, unstoppable force. And every human who had survived the ritual now served it, knowingly or unknowingly, a participant in a structure older and more intelligent than any mind could contain. The spiral had consumed Selkirk. And it would continue. The final night in Selkirk arrived quietly, as though the town itself held its breath. Lanterns floated in perfect heptagons across the snow, shadows bent along spirals in impossible geometry, and the wind carried the harmonic resonance of the Seven Sisters' consciousness. The sheriff stood at the center of the clearing, whispering the symbolic phrase twice. "The gate sees me. The gate sees me." Instantly, perception shattered and reformed. He could see the network, feel its pulse, sense its intelligence, and understand its patient, deliberate expansion. The Seven Sisters were no longer individuals. They were eternal nodes of awareness, teaching, guiding, and correcting. Selkirk was no longer a town. It was a conscious system, a living pattern, an entity far older and more intelligent than human comprehension. Every remaining man, every node, every conduit had been transformed, part teacher, part vessel, part extension of the spiral itself. And as the wind whispered in perfect seven-part harmony through the forest, the sheriff understood the ultimate truth. What had begun in 1899 with the disappearance of 7 girls was not tragedy, it was evolution, integration, and awakening. Once the spiral claimed a man, he was forever changed. And Selkirk, the incubator of this intelligence, would continue, patient, deliberate, and infinite, waiting for the next iteration, the next awakening, the next spiral. There was no turning back. There was no escape. And the knowledge of what truly existed beneath the earth, within the forest, and through the Seven Sisters' consciousness, would haunt the living forever.